Imagine being born into a palace, destined to rule an empire. You have everything you could ever want, except a body that works and a mind that's clear. And the reason for your suffering isn't a curse or a disease, but a family secret hidden in plain sight. Your parents, your grandparents, and their parents before them were all too closely related. Asterisk power, prestige, and bloodlines. For centuries, that was the royal formula for success. But behind the glittering crowns and the grandeur of the palaces, a darker obsession was at play, keeping that bloodline absolutely pure. In the world's most powerful dynasties, love and personal choice were often cast aside for duty and genetics. Cousins were wed to cousins and uncles to their nieces. Slowly, generation by generation, the devastating consequences began to emerge in twisted limbs, in failing minds, and in haunting legacies that history simply could not ignore. Today, we are uncovering the shocking truth about royal inbreeding, looking not just at how it happened, but at the terrible price paid by the monarchs who lived through its devastating cost. From strange and painful deformities to rulers who were tragically unfit to rule, these stories are as heartbreaking as they are unforgettable. First, what exactly is inbreeding? By definition, it's reproduction between individuals who are closely related, siblings, cousins, or uncles and nieces. For most ordinary people, this might sound completely unthinkable, but for centuries, the royal families of Europe sought, as a necessary, calculated strategy, by marrying within their own bloodline, they hoped to preserve their family's exclusive claim to the throne, concentrate their political alliances, and prevent their vast wealth from scattering to rival houses. What they didn't fully understand, however, was that this very practice was dramatically increasing the risk of severe genetic disorders. Inbreeding makes it far more likely for a child to inherit two identical copies of a recessive gene, a combination that can lead to a wide range of debilitating physical and mental conditions. To measure the extent of inbreeding, scientists use what's called the inbreeding coefficient. A score of 0 means there is no inbreeding at all, while a score of 1 would represent total genetic sameness. To put that in perspective, children of first cousins have a coefficient of 0.06 to 5, which translates to about a 6.25% risk of shared harmful genes. But when it comes to children of siblings or parent-child relationships, that number skyrockets to 0.25, a staggering 25%. Now that we understand the science, let's dive into the lives of the monarchs who were forever shaped by this silent, creeping danger. One family stands head and shoulders above all others in its unwavering dedication to dynastic inbreeding, the Habsburgs. As rulers of the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, Austria, and beyond, they were a political powerhouse for over 500 years. But their family tree wasn't a tree at all. It was more of a tangled, looping knot. The Habsburgs became infamous for arranging marriages between uncles and nieces, first cousins, and even double cousins. As a result, their bloodline became alarmingly condensed over the generations. The genetic consequences of this practice eventually manifested in a distinct physical deformity that became known as the Habsburg jaw, protruding lower jaw so pronounced that it became synonymous with the dynasty itself. This wasn't just a cosmetic quirk. The severe jaw deformity often made chewing difficult, speech unclear, and led to a lifetime of real health complications, and no Habsburg monarch paid a higher price than King Charles II of Spain. Born from a union between an uncle and his niece, Charles had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.25. Even though his parents weren't siblings, his family had inbred so heavily for so long that his genetic makeup was just as compromised. He struggled with a multitude of severe health conditions right from birth. Charles had a misshapen skull, an oversized tongue that made it incredibly difficult to speak, and suffered from severe learning disabilities. He couldn't walk unaided until he was 8 years old and didn't speak until he was 4. Chronic illnesses plagued him his entire life: measles, rubella, smallpox, and likely severe kidney and hormonal disorders. Many believe he was sterile, and he never fathered a child. Nicknamed Charles the Bewitched, his very existence was often blamed on curses and witchcraft. But the true, tragic explanation lay in his lineage. Even after his death, Charles's tragedy continued. His autopsy revealed chilling details: a heart the size of a peppercorn, decaying organs, and a single blackened testicle. His reign brought an end to the Spanish Habsburg line and ushered in a devastating war for succession that engulfed Europe. Next, we turn to Don Carlos, the only son of King Philip II of Spain and Maria of Portugal. His life reads like a dark, cautionary tale of genetic collapse. Because of generations of cousin marriages, Don Carlos had only for great-grandparents half the number a person usually has. He was born with misaligned limbs, differing leg lengths, and suffered from intense behavioral problems from a very early age. As a teenager, he descended into shocking violence and paranoia. He once forced a servant to eat feces and was known to frequently beat animals to death. After suffering a head injury in his late teens, doctors drilled into his skull using trepanning, a crude and dangerous procedure meant to relieve pressure on the brain. The injury only worsened his erratic behavior. Don Carlos began mutilating himself and attempting to harm others, including trying to shoot and strangle his own half-brother, Don John of Austria, when he plotted to flee to the Netherlands too. Aligned with rebels, it was the final straw. His own father, King Philip, ordered his arrest. Don Carlos was confined to his quarters under constant surveillance, stripped of all tools, glass, or any sharp objects. Within 6 months, he had wasted away either by illness, starvation, or possibly poison. He died at just 23 years old. In the grand courts of Imperial Vienna, where military marches echoed and ministers debated under frescoed ceilings, one figure stood quietly apart: Ferdinand I of Austria. Born in 1793, Ferdinand entered the world not as a symbol of strength, but as a frail heir weighed down by centuries of compressed bloodlines. His parents were double first cousins, an arrangement that on paper united royal houses but, in practice, handed Ferdinand a genetic hand stacked with complications. From infancy, his condition was painfully clear. He suffered from hydrocephalus, a disorder that caused fluid to collect in his skull, resulting in pressure, pain, and a misshapen head. He endured frequent and severe epileptic seizures that sometimes struck without warning multiple times a day. His speech was slow and slurred, his motor skills so underdeveloped that basic actions like opening a door or climbing a step were monumental tasks. Yet Ferdinand was no fool. In private moments, he surprised those around him with a sharp sense of humor, a photographic memory, and a fondness for science, art, and languages. He spoke 5 of them. His journals reflected a man trapped inside a malfunctioning body, yet still capable of deep thought, observation, and curiosity. Still, in a time when monarchy demanded more than just ceremony, his disabilities posed a serious political problem. When he was crowned Emperor of Austria in 1835, it was a largely symbolic act. The reins of power were swiftly passed to a council. Led by the formidable Prince Metternich, Ferdinand might have worn the crown, but he never truly ruled. His marriage to Maria Anna of Sardinia, another royal relative, was a quiet arrangement with no children, largely because his medical condition made intimacy nearly impossible. When revolutionary winds swept across Europe in 1848 demanding change, Ferdinand was gently ushered into abdication. And perhaps for the first time in his life, he found peace. In retirement, he lived a life many described as serene, strolling through Prague and handing out sweets to children. Known to locals not as a failed emperor, but as Ferdinand the Benign, he died in 1885 at the age of 82, a remarkably long life given the odds he faced. Few monarchs bore the emotional scars of dynastic obsession more deeply than Maria I of Portugal, the first woman to ever rule the country in her own right. Her reign began with optimism and piety, but ended in anguish, exile, and heartbreaking madness. Born in 1734, Maria's bloodline was a tangled web of connections to the Habsburgs and other close relatives. She herself was married to her father's younger brother, Pedro III, a union designed to protect the throne, not the people who sat on it. Early in life, Maria exhibited intense religious devotion and an almost mystical sense of guilt. As queen, she was compassionate and determined, but after the death of her husband in 1786, her mental health began to crumble. The back-to-back losses of her eldest son, her daughter, and a beloved grandson plunged her into a spiral of grief and despair. Her breakdowns became public. She began hearing voices, believed herself cursed, and reportedly screamed during court functions that she was burning in hell. Diagnosed with religious mania, she was quietly removed from power in 1792. Her suffering wasn't over. When Napoleon invaded Portugal, the royal family fled to Brazil. Isolated and still trapped in her delusions, she earned the nickname Maria the Mad. She died in 1816, far from the country she once ruled, her mind long gone. These royal lives were meant to be gilded, filled with silk, jewels, and authority. But beneath the crown, there often stood a person shattered by biology, expectation, and centuries of misguided tradition. Inbreeding wasn't seen as cruelty. It was seen as a political necessity. But as generation after generation inherited the same flawed genes, history bore witness to the consequences: malformed bodies, stunted minds, paranoia, seizures, sorrow, and sometimes madness. Each monarch we've explored was more than just a list of symptoms. They were complex, sometimes kind, and often tragic figures, shaped by choices they never got to make. And while history remembers their crowns, perhaps it's time we also remember their humanity, because in the end, they didn't just inherit kingdoms. They inherited the terrible cost of them.